The morning over northern Europe carried a silence that felt heavier than the frost. Villages were still waking, fires just beginning to curl from chimneys, when the first distant tremor stirred the air. It was faint at first, like a low murmur beneath the earth, but it grew, gathering strength, until every farmhouse window rattled in its frame. Above the clouds, lines of silver machines carved their way eastward. To those below, they looked endless, like a river of metal stretched across the heavens. To those inside, it felt like stepping into the mouth of destiny. In one cockpit, a young pilot adjusted the straps of his harness. His gloves were stiff with cold, but the sweat already forming under them betrayed the weight in his chest. He had read the maps, memorized the flak zones, rehearsed the maneuvers. Yet all of that faded when the engines drummed as one, when the formation aligned into the kind of order only war could create. He was not flying alone. Beside him, behind him, above him, an armada of wings beat against the sky. Each Mustang was more than an aircraft, it was a promise. A promise that this time the bombers would not fly unguarded into the storm. Across the horizon, another tide was rising. In hangars scattered around Berlin and the fields beyond, ground crews worked with frantic energy. Oil stains spread across their sleeves, boots slipping on frozen ground, as Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs coughed into life. Pilots, some veterans and others hardly more than boys, pulled on their oxygen masks and whispered a silent farewell to the earth beneath them. The Reich demanded defense, and the summons was answered, no matter how desperate the odds. The stage was set. One side believed its new machine could finally turn the tide. The other clung to experience, to pride, and to the belief that courage alone might yet bend history. Neither knew that the clash awaiting them would carve a scar across the sky so deep that Germany's air force would never truly heal from it. This was not just another mission. This was a reckoning. And tonight, you and I will walk through that reckoning together. We will step into the frost of English airfields, feel the shudder of engines as men taxied toward fate, and we will climb high into the thin, freezing air above Berlin. We will hear the crackle of radios, the scream of dives, and the silence that followed when wings were torn from the sky. We will see how, in a single day, the balance of power in the air shifted forever. If you're fascinated by the hidden corners of World War II, the stories not just of machines and battles, but of the men who carried them into history, then this is the place for you. Subscribe now, join this growing community of history enthusiasts, and stay with us until the very end of this story. Because the day the Mustangs met the Luftwaffe over Berlin was not only about who won or lost, it was about how the war itself was transformed. The winter of 1944 lingered long over Europe. The forests of Saxony and Brandenburg were stripped bare, their branches skeletal against a sky the color of steel. Roads were frozen, rivers sluggish with ice, and the people who trudged along them carried a heaviness that had little to do with the season. Germany's war machine, once unstoppable, was beginning to tremble under the weight of years of conflict. Factories strained to meet impossible quotas. Fuel, once abundant, was rationed to the point of starvation. And in the skies, the very domain that had once symbolized the Reich's might, the balance was shifting. Only a few years earlier, the Luftwaffe had been the blade at the tip of Blitzkrieg. Messerschmitt Bf 109s had swept over Poland and France, cutting apart resistance with alarming precision. The Focke-Wulf 190 introduced later had seemed an apex predator, fast, rugged, and devastating in combat. For a time these machines and the men who flew them appeared untouchable. Yet war does not remain static. As the years dragged on, attrition gnawed at Germany's strength. Pilots were lost one by one. Factories were bombed. Fuel convoys were shattered on distant roads. And the Luftwaffe, stretched across the Eastern Front, North Africa and Western Europe, was slowly bled dry. On the other side of the Channel, another story was taking shape. The United States Army Air Forces, committed to the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, had learned their lessons in blood. In 1943, missions over places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had nearly broken them. Bombers, flying without long-range escorts, had been torn to pieces by waves of German fighters. Crews returned shattered, or did not return at all. It became clear that no matter how tough AB-17 was, no matter how many gunners it carried, the bombers alone could not punch into the heart of Germany and survive. The answer came not in theory but in steel and wings. The North American P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast and above all long-ranged, emerged almost as if summoned by the desperation of the moment. Its story began humbly, an experiment built to satisfy British requests. But when the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was married to its frame, the aircraft transformed. Suddenly, here was a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before. It could dance with the Messerschmitts at 20,000 feet, strike them down, and still escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the men who had watched formations of B-17s burn, the Mustang was salvation given form. By early 1944, hundreds of these new fighters crossed the Atlantic. They gleamed on English airfields, their noses painted with names, teeth, and symbols that spoke of both humor and dread. Pilots spoke of how the Mustang seemed alive, how the slightest touch of the stick sent it rolling gracefully, how its 6.50 caliber machine guns could turn a Predator into wreckage in seconds. To fly was to feel, perhaps for the first time in years of war, that the Allies might truly seize command of the sky. The Luftwaffe saw this shift with growing alarm. They were not blind. Reports filtered back from the front lines of new American fighters that would not turn back at the border, that seemed to stalk their formations relentlessly. German commanders knew what was coming, yet had few answers. Jet designs like the Me-262 whispered of miracles, but they were not yet ready. Fuel was scarce. Training programs, once rigorous, were shortened to weeks. Boys barely old enough to shave strapped themselves into machines they had scarcely mastered. They were thrown into combat not because they were ready, but because the Reich demanded bodies in the sky. And then came the decision that changed everything. Berlin itself would be struck in daylight. It was not simply a military choice. It was symbolic. To send American bombers over Berlin, escorted by swarms of Mustangs, was to hammer the Reich at its very heart. It would declare to the world that no fortress, not even the capital of Hitler's empire, was beyond the reach of Allied power. For the men tasked with flying it, the mission was both terrifying and electrifying. They had seen what had happened at Schweinfurt. They knew the cost of daylight raids. Yet with the Mustang at their side there was a chance that this time they would not be slaughtered but would instead deal the mortal wound. Dawn broke cold on March 6, 1944. On English airfields, frost clung to the wings of bombers like crystal veins. Ground crews moved among them, their breath misting in the air, tools clinking as they tightened bolts and checked fuel lines. Inside the mess halls, young men pushed eggs and toast into their mouths without tasting them. Some cracked jokes, laughter brittle with nerves. Others stared silently into mugs of coffee, the weight of maps and orders pressing on them like lead. In briefing rooms, cigarette smoke hung thick in the air as commanders pointed to Berlin on the wall-sized maps. Red lines cut across Germany like wounds. Arrows marked intercept zones, flak concentrations, rendezvous points. The words spoken were calm, deliberate, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. This was no ordinary raid. The Luftwaffe would throw everything it had into defending the capital. The losses could be staggering. But the reward, if the mission succeeded, could be decisive. Out on the flight lines, Mustangs gleamed in the weak morning light. Their pilots walked toward them with parachutes slung over their shoulders. Some reached out to touch the fuselage, a ritual, a gesture of faith as if the machine itself were a comrade. Climbing into the cockpit, strapping down, closing the canopy, it felt like sealing oneself inside a destiny that could not be avoided. Engines coughed, then thundered to life. The ground trembled as one after another roared awake, until the entire field shook with the combined force of war machines hungry for the sky. And then they began to roll, one by one, lifting into the pale light of morning. From the ground, it looked like an endless river of silver streaming eastward, wings catching the sun as they climbed. It was not just bombers. It was an armada. It was history itself taking flight. For those inside the cockpits, the world narrowed to the vibrations of the engine, the steady chatter of the radio, the frost forming on the canopy edges. They knew the Germans would come. The only question was when, and how many. Across the German countryside, the alarms began to sound. In radar stations hidden among pine forests and along the North Sea coast, operators stared at their glowing screens in disbelief. The clusters of signals were thicker than anything they had seen before, hundreds upon hundreds of blips, forming a tide that pushed steadily eastward. Phones rang in command posts, urgent voices barked into headsets, and sirens wailed in towns and villages. People paused in their daily routines, tilting their heads skyward as if they could already hear the storm. In Berlin itself, the sound was faint at first, little more than a distant hum. But it grew, slowly, steadily, until the city's inhabitants felt it in their bones. The Reich's capital had been bombed before, of course, but not like this, not in daylight, not with the promise of an escort powerful enough to carve through Germany's defenses. The propaganda posters that had once promised invincibility now seemed hollow. Families rushed to shelters. Soldiers reported to anti-aircraft positions. And on the airfields surrounding the city, the Luftwaffe prepared for battle. Pilots pulled on their flight gear with trembling hands. Leather helmets, oxygen masks, heavy boots, everything felt heavier than usual. Many of them were boys barely out of training. Their instructors had told them the essentials. Keep formation, fire short bursts, dive when you can, climb if you must. But theory was one thing, combat another. Some had flown only a handful of missions. A few had never even fired their guns in real combat. Yet they strapped themselves into the cockpits of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs because the Reich demanded it. And because, deep down, they still clung to the belief that their machines could hold the line. Veteran pilots were scattered among them, men who had fought over France, over the Channel, over Russia's endless steppes. They carried themselves differently. Their eyes were steady, their movements precise. They knew the odds were grim. They had watched their comrades vanish one by one, either consumed by flames in the sky or captured far from home. Yet they climbed into their machines anyway, driven by duty, pride, and perhaps by the knowledge that there was no choice left. Engines screamed to life across the fields. Mechanics ran clear as propellers whipped the air into deadly torrents. One after another, fighters rolled down narrow strips of tarmac, their wheels kicking up frost and mud. They lifted into the cold March air, climbing steeply, their black crosses stark against the pale morning sky. From above, the formations resembled flocks of predatory birds, circling, gathering, preparing to strike. The commanders on the ground knew exactly what they faced. Intelligence reports had warned of the new American fighter, the Mustang, capable of following the bombers all the way to Berlin. Still, there was hope that numbers could tell. Nearly 400 fighters had been mustered for the defense. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, nimble and proven, and Focke-Wulf 190s, powerful but fuel-hungry. Together, they formed a swarm, a shield meant to throw itself against the enemy's advance. Perhaps, if the attacks were timed well, if the bombers were hit hard enough, the Reich's capital could be spared. High above, the American formations droned steadily eastward. The bombers held their tight boxes, their wings overlapping like the plates of an armored phalanx. Frost formed inside their fuselages, oxygen masks stiffened against their faces, but still they pressed on mile after mile. Gunners scanned the skies, eyes darting to every glint of light, every shadow on the horizon. They knew the Germans were coming. They could feel it as surely as if the air itself carried the warning. The Mustangs flew above and beside them, taut with anticipation. Pilots shifted in their seats, checking fuel gauges, testing the triggers that armed their 6 guns. Radios crackled with clipped exchanges, call signs, positions, reminders to stay sharp. Beneath the calm of their voices was a current of tension, a recognition of what was about to happen. 262 fighters against nearly 400. The odds were cruel. But the mission was clear. Protect the bombers. Reach Berlin. Strike the heart of the Reich. And then, on the eastern horizon, specks appeared. Tiny at first, like flecks of soot on the pale canvas of the sky. But they multiplied quickly, swelling into lines, into wings, into the unmistakable silhouettes of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. The Luftwaffe had come. The warning went out across the American formations. The radios snapped alive with urgent voices. Bandits! Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Gunners swung their turrets, guns spitting bursts into the approaching swarm. The Mustangs peeled away from their escort lines, climbing, rolling, diving, turning toward the attackers with a ferocity that mirrored the Germans' own. At 20,000 feet, the sky shattered. The first collisions were brutal and sudden. A German formation dove from the sun, cannon fire flashing as they raked the bombers. One B-17 exploded instantly, its frame disintegrating in a blossom of fire and smoke. Men tumbled from the wreck, some consumed immediately, others drifting helplessly in parachutes. The bomber's gunners returned fire, tracers stitching across the heavens, punching holes in the diving fighters. A Messerschmitt spiraled away trailing smoke, its pilot struggling in vain to steady the burning machine. Then the Mustangs struck. They rolled into the German formations with ruthless precision, their guns hammering. P-51 closed on a Focke-Wulf, bullets tearing into its engine until it erupted in black smoke, wings snapping as the pilot bailed too late. Another Mustang darted through a formation of Messerschmitts, weaving, rolling, firing in bursts that shredded one and forced another into a desperate dive. The sky became chaos, contrails twisting into knots, engines screaming, metal tearing, fire blooming against the cold blue backdrop. There was no clear front line. Everywhere was danger. Everywhere was death. A Mustang pilot saw a German lining up on a bomber and dove at him, closing the distance in seconds. He fired until the Focke-Wulf burst into flames, but before he could pull away, another Messerschmitt fell on him from above, its cannons pounding. His engine seized, flames licking into the cockpit. He fought to unbuckle, bailed, and drifted down through the smoke, watching the battle rage on above. In the bombers, the crews fought their own desperate battles. Turrets clattered, gunners shouting over the intercom as they tracked diving fighters. Some screamed warnings, others cried out as their stations were hit, shrapnel tearing through flesh and steel alike. Oxygen froze in hoses, blood pooled on metal floors, yet still they fired, still they flew. Each mile forward was bought with lives. Below, in villages and fields, civilians craned their necks to the sky. To them, it looked as if the heavens themselves were at war. Contrails ripped apart, smoke spiraled downward, burning fragments of wings and fuselages rained into the earth. The ground shook with the impact of falling machines. Fires burned in forests and farms, spreading black scars across the countryside. For the Luftwaffe pilots, the reality was dawning. The Mustangs were everywhere. No longer did they chase the bombers alone. Now they found themselves hunted, pursued relentlessly by Americans who matched their speed, their climb, their dive. The old advantage was gone. And with it, perhaps, the hope of holding Germany's skies. The sky over Germany had ceased to be a place of flight. It had become a furnace. Smoke trails hung in jagged lines, contrails twisted into snarls, and everywhere the thunder of engines merged with the rattle of gunfire. It was no longer possible to tell where one formation ended and another began. The air itself seemed to vibrate with violence. A Mustang darted through the chaos, its wings flashing silver as it rolled into the path of a Messerschmitt. The American pilot squeezed the trigger, the 6 guns shuddering as tracers poured forward. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the German's cockpit erupted in fire, the machine spiraling downward, its pilot fighting desperately to escape before it slammed into the earth. But the victory was fleeting. Even as the Mustang pulled away, another German fell upon it, cannon shells smashing into the fuselage. The Mustang burst apart, scattering debris that glittered like shattered glass against the pale sky. This was the rhythm of the battle: strike, counterstrike, death, and reprieve. No man was safe for more than a moment. Radios filled with clipped cries: "Break left! I'm hit! Cover me!" Punctuated by the sudden static of silence when a voice was cut short forever. For every cheer of victory, there were 2 moments of grief. And still the fighting raged. In one bomber, a waist gunner pressed his frozen cheek against the metal sight. His fingers were numb, his gloves stiff, but his eyes never left the Messerschmitt streaking in from the side. He fired, the gun shaking in his hands, tracers stitching across the sky. The German flinched, broke away, and vanished into smoke. The gunner exhaled in relief, only to hear the dull, horrifying thud of shells striking his own aircraft. The bomber shuddered, its frame groaning, one engine bursting into flame. Fire spread across the wing. Men scrambled for extinguishers, for tools, for hope. But the damage was too great. Slowly, inexorably, the bomber rolled over, breaking from formation. Parachutes blossomed from its sides, some too late, some never at all. The rest of the crew pressed on in their remaining stations, tears stinging their eyes, mouths clenched shut. To turn back was impossible. To continue forward was the only choice left. Above them, the Mustangs carved their deadly dance. They attacked in pairs, in fours, weaving through the Germans with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. One Mustang would dive, forcing an enemy to evade, while another slid in behind to finish the kill. Again and again the tactic worked, until German formations began to scatter, their cohesion unraveling. The Luftwaffe had always relied on discipline, on tightly controlled groups that could strike with precision. But now, under the relentless assault, that order crumbled into chaos. For some Germans, desperation took on reckless forms. One pilot, his guns jammed, aimed his Messerschmitt directly at a bomber. He closed the distance with terrifying speed, ignoring the tracers that riddled his wings. At the last instant, the bomber crew realized what he intended. There was no time to evade. The Messerschmitt smashed headlong into the bomber's belly. The explosion lit the sky like a second sun, fire consuming both machines instantly. For a heartbeat, the surrounding aircraft faltered, stunned by the sight. Then the battle swallowed the moment whole and the killing went on. On the ground, villagers huddled in fields and forests, watching the spectacle with a mixture of awe and terror. The sky seemed alive with fire. Bodies fell like shadows through smoke, parachutes drifting slowly, silently toward Earth. Children clung to their mothers. Old men crossed themselves. Farmers tried to beat out fires that spread from the wreckage. But the scale of the destruction was beyond their reach. It was not a battle in their sky, it was a storm and they could only endure it. The Luftwaffe pilots, many of them scarcely older than the children on the ground, fought with a courage born of desperation. They twisted their machines through impossible dives, pulling until blood pounded in their temples, until their vision blurred. They fired until their barrels glowed, until their ammunition was gone. Some survived. Many did not. The Americans seemed endless, the Mustangs appearing from every angle, their endurance unbroken, their speed unrelenting. A veteran German, his hands steady on the controls, whispered into his mask, "This is not possible." But it was. And it was happening above Berlin. Inside the Mustangs, the Americans were scarcely less shaken. Their aircraft gave them confidence, but not invulnerability. Men watched their friends vanish in fireballs, saw parachutes torn apart by enemy fire, heard the last words of comrades before silence claimed them. The exhilaration of the hunt was always tempered by the grim tally of loss. And yet they fought on because the mission demanded it, because the bombers depended on them, because turning back was unthinkable. By late morning, the battle had stretched into hours. Engines coughed and failed. Fuel gauges dipped toward empty. The air was thick with smoke and debris, the sun itself dimmed by the haze of burning oil. And still neither side yielded. The bombers pressed deeper toward Berlin. The Luftwaffe pressed harder to stop them. The Mustangs pressed everywhere at once, a shield that struck as fiercely as it defended. At one point, a Mustang and a Messerschmitt became locked in a deadly spiral, circling each other downward, neither pilot willing to break. They spun through smoke, through fire, through the wreckage of their fallen comrades, until finally both vanished into the clouds below. Whether they lived or died, no one could tell. Their duel was swallowed by the chaos of the larger war. The cost was mounting with every passing minute. Fields across Saxony and Brandenburg burned with wreckage. Villages shook as machines slammed into the earth. The Luftwaffe had lost dozens of fighters already, many of them flown by veterans whose experience could never be replaced. The Americans had lost Mustangs and bombers alike, each one a scar on the landscape, each one a story cut short. And yet the formations pressed on, driven by something greater than survival. For the Americans, it was the mission, the need to prove that Berlin could be struck in daylight, that the Reich could be pierced at its heart. For the Germans, it was pride, duty, the refusal to surrender their skies without a fight. Both sides bled for these convictions, staining the heavens with their sacrifice. And through it all, the battle's rhythm repeated: strike, counterstrike, silence. The clash seemed endless, yet everyone involved knew that time itself was the true enemy. Fuel, ammunition, endurance, these were the measures of survival now. And for the Luftwaffe, those measures were running out. The midday sun burned weakly through the haze, its light fractured by smoke and vapor trails. From the ground it looked like a canvas torn apart by fire, a patchwork of white scars, black smears and drifting fragments of steel. From above, it felt like the very air was closing in, the horizon lost behind walls of smoke. And still the fighting raged. For the Luftwaffe, the morning had already been costly. Squadrons that had roared into the sky with confidence were now scattered, their formations broken, their numbers dwindling. Veteran leaders who had once steadied the younger pilots were gone, their machines falling in flames or shattered across the countryside. In their place, frightened voices crackled over the radio, half-trained recruits calling for help, struggling to hold position, begging for guidance that never came. Cohesion, the very lifeblood of the Luftwaffe's tactics, was unraveling in real time. The Americans pressed the advantage relentlessly. Mustangs swarmed through the German ranks, appearing from above, from below, from the sun itself. They flew in tight pairs, disciplined and coordinated, striking with precision and vanishing before counterattacks could take hold. One German pilot, his voice tight with fear, shouted into his radio, "They are everywhere. Everywhere at once." His words captured what so many of his comrades were experiencing. The sense that the enemy was inexhaustible, that no escape was possible. For the bomber crews, the shield of Mustangs felt almost miraculous. They had not forgotten the nightmare raids of the year before, when German fighters had torn into them without mercy, when formations had been whittled down to fragments before reaching their targets. Today was different. Though losses were still heavy, the Mustangs kept the swarms at bay, tearing at their attackers with a ferocity that bought the bombers the space they needed. The path to Berlin was bloodied, but it remained open. Inside the cockpits, the Americans felt the shift as well. They could sense it in the way their enemies flew, less coordinated, more desperate, their maneuvers frantic rather than calculated. Some Germans broke off entirely, diving for the safety of the clouds or the cover of forests below. Others pressed in with reckless courage, but their attacks often lacked the sharp edge of discipline. For every Mustang they struck, two more were waiting. For every bomber they damaged, another wave pressed forward. The balance that had once favored the Luftwaffe was tilting, and it was tilting fast. On the ground, commanders tried to make sense of the chaos. Reports poured in, squadrons wiped out, airfields stripped bare of reserves, fuel running short. Replacement pilots were rushed forward, but they lacked the training to stand against seasoned Americans and Mustangs. The decision was stark: throw them into the fire anyway or abandon Berlin's skies to the enemy. The Reich chose to throw them in. And the sky devoured them without mercy. Above the city, the spectacle grew almost unbearable. Bombers droned steadily, their engines a ceaseless heartbeat. Mustangs wheeled and dove, contrails curling behind them like scars. Germans fell in flames, their parachutes drifting slowly toward captivity or death. Civilians huddled in shelters listened to the distant roar and prayed it would end. But for hours it did not end. It only intensified. By early afternoon, the Luftwaffe's losses were staggering. Entire squadrons had been reduced to a handful of survivors. The veterans who remained fought with grim determination, but they were overwhelmed, their every maneuver countered, their every strike answered. The young recruits fared worse, often firing wildly or diving too steeply, becoming easy prey for the Mustangs that hunted them. The attrition was merciless. What Germany lost that day was not merely aircraft. It was experience, the irreplaceable skill of pilots who had once carried the Luftwaffe's reputation across Europe. Each veteran who fell was a wound that could not heal. And still the Germans fought on. Pride, duty, desperation, all kept them in the sky long after logic demanded retreat. One pilot, his machine riddled with holes, his instruments shattered, pressed forward anyway, chasing a bomber until his guns ran dry. Another, wounded and barely conscious, refused to bail, guiding his crippled fighter into one last dive before the engine failed completely. These acts of defiance slowed the Americans only for moments. They did not change the tide. The Mustangs, by contrast, seemed untouchable. Their endurance allowed them to fight hour after hour without faltering, their speed carried them wherever they were needed, and their firepower punished every mistake the enemy made. The pilots felt the shift in their bones. They were no longer merely defending the bombers. They were dominating the sky. In one formation, a Mustang leader spoke calmly over the radio. "Keep pressing. They're breaking. Stay tight, keep pressing." His words carried a quiet certainty, a recognition that the turning point had come. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out before his eyes. It was not a question of if they would break, but when. On the ground below, farmers and villagers watched the fragments of the battle rain down upon their fields. Burning aircraft plowed into forests, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Pieces of wings and fuselages landed in pastures, setting haystacks ablaze. In one village, a Messerschmitt slammed into a farmhouse, leveling it in an instant, leaving only fire and silence where a family had lived hours before. The war in the sky was not confined to the sky. It reached down, leaving scars across the land itself. By the time the bombers reached the outskirts of Berlin, The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been that morning. Hundreds had risen to defend the capital. Barely a fraction remained. Those who limped home carried not victory but exhaustion, their machines riddled with holes, their minds scarred by the ferocity of what they had endured. Some landed on empty airfields, others crashed into fields when their fuel ran dry. Mechanics and commanders counted the wrecks, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The Luftwaffe had bled before. But never like this. Above, the Mustangs still circled, vigilant, unyielding. They had proven themselves beyond doubt, not merely as escorts, not merely as protectors, but as predators capable of breaking the very backbone of Germany's air force. The balance of power in the skies had shifted. And for those who survived that day on both sides, the knowledge was inescapable. The Luftwaffe had been dealt a wound from which it could never fully recover. The city of Berlin lay below, vast and sprawling, its streets stretching like veins across the heart of the Reich. From altitude, the bombers' crews could see the smoke already rising from the city's factories and rail yards, the scars of previous raids etched into rooftops and avenues. Yet this time was different. This time they had come in daylight, under the guard of Mustangs that had carved open the skies. The target was no longer distant, it was directly beneath their wings. Engines drummed in steady rhythm as the formation tightened. Inside the lead bomber, the bombardier crouched over his Norden bomb sight, his face pale with focus. Every second mattered. The aircraft flew straight and level, holding steady even as flak exploded around them, each black puff rocking the formation, each burst a reminder that death was waiting for any mistake. The bombardier called out the markers, approaching, steady, steady. His voice was calm, practiced, yet his hands trembled ever so slightly on the controls. Below, Berlin braced itself. Air raid sirens wailed, their mechanical cries echoing across streets and courtyards. Civilians rushed into shelters, clutching children, dragging bundles of possessions. Anti-aircraft batteries filled the air with steel, their barrels glowing red as they fired relentlessly into the oncoming armada. Windows rattled, walls shook, and the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to break. And then the doors opened. From hundreds of bombers, payloads tumbled downward, strings of bombs falling in eerie silence before detonating in thunderous waves. Rail yards erupted in fire, warehouses collapsed into dust, and entire blocks were engulfed in rolling flames. The sound was deafening, a ceaseless roar that drowned out even the engines above. For those on the ground, the world became a maelstrom of dust and fire, buildings crumbling, streets vanishing beneath clouds of debris. For the crews above, it was both terrifying and surreal, watching entire neighborhoods vanish in seconds, knowing that their bombs struck factories and depots but also homes, shops, and lives. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, tried desperately to disrupt the bombardment. A handful of fighters clawed through the Mustang screen, diving straight into the formation. One broke through, loosing his cannons into the belly of a bomber. The American machine shuddered, flames licking at its fuselage, but it held formation long enough to drop its bombs before peeling away, smoke trailing from its tail. The German turned to strike again, but was met by a Mustang that swept down from above, guns blazing. The Luftwaffe pilot never had a chance. His machine disintegrated in midair, scattering pieces across the rooftops below. Inside one of the bombers, a radio operator pressed his headset tight, listening to the frantic chatter. Reports flooded in, bombs away. Target struck. We've lost number 3. Voices overlapped, cut in and out, some ending abruptly with static. He scribbled notes even as his eyes darted to the windows, watching fire rise from the city below. It was a strange vantage point, safe in the sense of altitude, yet exposed to every threat the Germans could muster. He thought briefly of the people below, anonymous shadows running through smoke. He shook the thought away. His duty was to the mission, to the men beside him, to the thousands of lives riding on the success of this raid. In the streets of Berlin, civilians clawed through rubble, coughing in the choking dust. Fire brigades rushed to burning districts, their hoses useless against the scale of destruction. Some screamed names of loved ones. Others sat silently amid ruins, shock hollowing their eyes. This was not the first raid they had endured, but in daylight, under the gaze of thousands of bombers, it felt different. It was not shadows in the night, it was the brazen daylight declaration that nowhere in Germany was safe anymore. As the last bombs fell, the formation began to turn westward. Their work was done, but the danger was far from over. Flak followed them mercilessly, bursting in their path, shredding wings and fuselages. Another bomber caught a direct hit. Its wings separated, the machine tumbling into the city below. Parachutes dotted the sky, some opening too low, others burning before they could fully unfurl. The men still alive inside the formation watched with clenched jaws, their eyes fixed ahead. To look too long at the falling comrades was to risk despair. The Mustangs swept in close once more, guarding the retreat. They strafed flak batteries when they could, silenced fighters before they could climb into firing position. Their presence gave the bombers a chance, thinning the gauntlet through which they had to pass. Still, losses continued. The path out of Berlin was as deadly as the approach. By late afternoon, the formations began to thin as damaged aircraft peeled away, some making emergency landings in open fields, others vanishing into the haze. The surviving bombers pressed westward, engines straining, fuel running low. Behind them, Berlin still burned, its skyline choked in smoke, flames flickering where once there had been factories, railways, and homes. For the Americans, the realization of what they had achieved began to sink in. They had done it. They had struck Berlin in daylight, escorted by Mustangs that had fought the Luftwaffe to exhaustion. The cost had been high, unbearably high, but the mission had succeeded. The Reich's capital had been pierced, its defenders humbled, its myth of invincibility shattered. For the men returning across the Channel, that knowledge was both a comfort and a burden. They had survived where many had not. They had struck a blow that history would remember. Yet they carried with them the images of friends falling in flames, of parachutes drifting helplessly, of fire swallowing the city below. In Berlin, the consequences were immediate and searing. Firefighters battled into the night. Civilians searched for missing family among ruins. Soldiers dug survivors from collapsed shelters, their hands raw and bleeding. Propaganda officials rushed to frame the raid as meaningless, insisting that the Reich spirit was unbroken. Yet among the people, a different realization spread. The enemy could reach them at any hour, even under the sun. No corner of the Reich was beyond the reach of Allied power. For the Luftwaffe, the raid marked more than just a defeat. It was a breaking point. Hundreds of fighters had been lost, many of them flown by irreplaceable veterans. The training pipeline could not produce replacements fast enough, and the fuel shortages crippled the ability to prepare new pilots. What had once been a fearsome air force was becoming a shell of itself. The Mustangs had not merely defended the bombers. They had carved deep wounds into the Luftwaffe's very core. Commanders in Berlin took stock of the losses with grim faces. They knew the truth. The skies belonged less and less to them with each passing day. The Americans, exhausted and grief-stricken, landed back in England as the sun dipped low on the horizon. Ground crews rushed to the battered aircraft, counting bullet holes, patching torn fuselages, carrying out the wounded. Pilots climbed stiffly from their cockpits, some collapsing onto the tarmac, others walking silently toward the mess hall. Few spoke. The noise of battle still rang in their ears, the images of destruction vivid behind their eyes. Success had been achieved, but celebration felt impossible. The cost of daylight victory was measured not in numbers, but in names, names that would never return from the sky. Night fell over Berlin like a shroud. The fire still burned, painting the sky in an angry orange glow that could be seen for miles in every direction. Columns of smoke twisted into the night air, mingling with the acrid stench of burning oil, scorched wood, and shattered stone. For the people who had survived the day's onslaught, there was no sleep. They huddled in cellars and shelters, listening to the groan of collapsing buildings and the distant crackle of flames. Children whimpered softly. Mothers tried to soothe them, though their own faces were pale and streaked with ash. The war, once fought far away in distant territories, had come crashing down into their very streets. For the German military leadership, the raid was a revelation they had dreaded but could no longer deny. Reports piled in through the night. Squadrons decimated, airfields littered with wreckage, veteran pilots missing or confirmed dead. The tally was more than just numbers on a page. Each loss represented years of experience, the kind of knowledge that could not be replaced in weeks or months. The Luftwaffe, once the razor-sharp spear of Blitzkrieg, was now fighting a war of attrition it could not hope to win. Factories still produced aircraft at impressive rates, But what good was a new Messerschmitt if there was no seasoned pilot to fly it? What use was a Focke-Wulf if its fuel supply was rationed down to dribbles? The balance was slipping further each month. The Mustang had tipped the scales, escorting the bombers so deep into the Reich that the Luftwaffe could no longer dictate the terms of battle. They had become the hunted in their own skies. In London and Washington, the news of the daylight strike on Berlin spread quickly. Newspapers hailed it as a milestone, proof that Allied air power could penetrate the very heart of the Reich and return intact. Headlines screamed of victory in the skies, though the casualty lists told a darker story. For the men who had flown, there was no triumphal cheer, only the quiet recognition that they had done something that once seemed impossible. Yet beneath their exhaustion there was also a shift in confidence. The enemy could be beaten, even in daylight, even over Berlin. That realization carried weight far beyond one raid. It was a turning of the tide in morale as much as in strategy. At the bomber bases across England, debriefings stretched late into the night. Crews sat slumped in chairs, their faces gray with fatigue, recounting details through clenched jaws. Heavy flak at the target, enemy fighters pressed hard. Mustangs drove them off. Some voices faltered as they spoke of comrades who had not returned. Empty chairs in the debriefing rooms were a stark reminder of the cost. Commanders listened, took notes, and marked charts. For them, the data was vital. For the crews, it was raw memory replayed aloud, each sentence a reminder of the firestorm they had flown through. Meanwhile, in German airfields, the silence was louder than any gunfire. The hangars were filled with damaged aircraft, some reparable, many beyond saving. Mechanics worked under dim lights, tools clattering against metal, though their hands shook from exhaustion. Pilots who had survived walked slowly across the tarmac, their faces hollow. Some avoided one another's eyes. Others stared upward, as if trying to make sense of the contrails still lingering faintly above the horizon. The once proud Luftwaffe squadrons were shadows of themselves, their rosters filled with empty spaces that no new recruit could truly fill. And yet, despite the losses, German propaganda machines churned into motion. Newspapers declared the raid a failed attempt, claiming heavy American losses, portraying the Luftwaffe as valiant defenders. Posters appeared overnight, urging civilians to stay strong, to believe that secret weapons were on the way. Jets, rockets, miracle machines that would soon sweep the enemy from the sky. But behind closed doors, in the smoky conference rooms of the Reich's command, the truth was laid bare. They could not keep up. Every month brought new raids, larger formations, more Mustangs slicing through their defenses. No matter how bravely the young pilots fought, the odds grew worse. The war in the air was slipping beyond recovery. For the Allies, the mission reinforced a lesson that would shape the months ahead. The bomber offensive was no longer just about destroying factories and rail yards. It was about breaking the Luftwaffe itself. Each raid drained the pool of experienced German pilots. Each battle forced the enemy to spend precious fuel and resources they could ill afford. The Mustang had given the Allies the means to grind down their opponent relentlessly. It was not quick, it was not bloodless, but it was working. Among the American crews, the memory of the Berlin raid lingered with mixed emotions. Some spoke with pride, telling themselves they had struck the very heart of the Reich. Others carried the burden of what they had seen, the firestorms below, the parachutes that never opened, the friends who never made it back. War had a way of etching itself into the souls of those who fought it, and the raid on Berlin left scars both visible and unseen. One pilot, sitting in the quiet of a dimly lit barracks, wrote in his journal, "We saw the city burn. We saw our own fall. They say it was a victory, and maybe it was. But victory tastes of smoke tonight." His words echoed the duality of the moment, triumph and tragedy intertwined, inseparable. On the ground in Berlin, the civilian population began to understand the magnitude of what had changed. Their city, once thought untouchable in daylight, had been laid open to destruction. Rumors spread in hushed whispers, that more raids would come, that the Allies would not stop until Germany itself lay in ruins. Each new morning brought fear of the next siren, the next wave of bombers, the next day when the sky would fall. Confidence in the Reich's invincibility cracked, replaced by dread. As winter turned to spring, the lessons of March 1944 became clear. The Luftwaffe was bleeding faster than it could heal. The Allies had found the key to daylight bombing, escort fighters with the range to go all the way in the teeth to defend the bombers. The balance of the air war had shifted, and with it, the course of the wider conflict. The Reich still fought with ferocity on every front, but in the skies, its days of dominance were over. The day the Mustangs reached Berlin had not ended the war, but it had ended an illusion that Germany could still command the air. The smoke above Berlin lingered for days, drifting across the countryside, a grim reminder visible to thousands of eyes. To the people below, it was not just smoke. It was the signal of change, the sign that their world was closing in, that the skies no longer belonged to them. For the Americans returning to their bases, it was a marker too, a line crossed, a promise kept, a mission that would echo long after the fires went out. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe told a story no German commander wished to read. What began as single defeats had become a pattern, a rhythm of loss that quickened with each raid. The Berlin strike was not an isolated storm. It was the first of many tempests that broke over the Reich with growing force. Again and again the bombers came, and again the Mustangs swept in to guard them. The Luftwaffe rose to meet the challenge, but each climb into battle drained its lifeblood. Every dogfight was another page torn from its history, another veteran gone, another young recruit hurled into the crucible too soon. Factories still turned out sleek fuselages and gleaming wings, but the pilots who strapped into them were shadows of the men who once ruled the skies over Poland, France, and Britain. Training programs were compressed, sometimes barely a few weeks before sending boys into combat. Instructors whispered their doubts. The aircraft were sound, but the hands at the controls trembled with inexperience. Against the Mustangs, fast, enduring, relentless, such imbalance was deadly. The Luftwaffe had once been predator. Now, in its own airspace, it was prey. The tempo of Allied operations intensified. No longer content to simply reach Berlin, commanders targeted oil plants, rail hubs, and aircraft factories across the Reich. The bombing campaign was designed not just to cripple production but to bleed away Germany's last strength, the fuel to fly and the men to fight. Mustang pilots spoke of the strange duality of their missions, escorting the lumbering bombers through hell, then chasing the interceptors that dared to climb into the sky. We owned the air by then, one remembered. Every time they came up, they lost more than they could afford. The German high command searched desperately for salvation. Eyes turned toward the so-called wonder weapons. Jet fighters like the Me-262 rocket interceptors, experimental designs that promised speed and power beyond anything the Allies could field. But they came too late, in too few numbers, hampered by shortages of fuel and the chaos of factories battered by constant raids. Each miracle machine required skilled pilots, and those were already gone. The dream of turning the tide with revolutionary technology flickered, but it could not burn against the gale of Allied air superiority. In the skies, the change was unmistakable. Where once American bomber crews had looked nervously for German interceptors, now they scanned the heavens with a growing sense of assurance. The Mustangs flew above, below, and beside them, weaving protective arcs. Enemy fighters still attacked, but the waves were thinner, the strikes less coordinated. Casualties remained, but the feeling of helplessness that had haunted the bombers in 1943 was fading. The Guardians were there and they were winning. On the ground, German civilians felt the shift as well. Cities that had once believed in the Reich's air shield now watched the sky with dread. Every siren meant another test of survival. Every contrail overhead was a reminder that the enemy could come and go at will. The crack in morale widened, spreading from the front lines into the homes of ordinary people. Letters from the front were filled with grief, telegrams carried news of sons lost in training flights or shot down in flames. Faith in victory waned, even as propaganda insisted the opposite. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely. Its pilots showed courage that cannot be denied, diving into formations against impossible odds, pressing attacks even when outnumbered. Yet courage could not fill empty fuel tanks. Bravery could not replace the years of training required to master combat in the air. The losses multiplied, and with each one the prospect of recovery slipped further away. The raid on Berlin had been a wound. The raids that followed tore it open wider, until the Luftwaffe bled without hope of healing. For the Allies, the momentum was intoxicating. Commanders spoke with growing confidence of round-the-clock bombing, Americans by day, British by night, relentless pressure that gave the Reich no pause. The Mustang was at the heart of this strategy. Without its range and power, the bombers would still be at the mercy of German guns. With it, the skies were transformed. The Allies had not only gained a weapon, they had seized the initiative. And once seized, it was not surrendered. In the briefing rooms, pilots pinned maps with fresh lines each morning. Targets grew deeper into Germany, each mission daring the Luftwaffe to respond. Sometimes the enemy rose in force, sometimes only in scattered flights. Each time the result was the same: more losses for the Reich, more proof that the tide could not be reversed. The rhythm of attrition became a drumbeat. Each beat echoed the truth: control of the skies was shifting irrevocably. And so the pace of history quickened. In the space of months, Germany went from challenger to defender, from master of the skies to survivor clinging to the ground. The American pilots, many of them barely older than the enemies they faced, carried themselves with a new kind of confidence. They had lived through Berlin. They had seen the Luftwaffe bleed. They knew that the next missions, though still deadly, would not break them as the earlier ones had. That knowledge alone was victory. For the men of the Luftwaffe, the realization was heavier. They still climbed into their cockpits, still strapped on their gear, still met the Mustangs head-on. But in their hearts they began to understand the truth. The Reich could no longer win the battle of the air. The question was no longer if defeat would come, but when. That shadow darkened every mission, every takeoff. The courage remained, but hope drained away. The climax of the air war had arrived. Not in a single dogfight, not in one spectacular battle, but in the grinding inevitability of attrition. The Mustangs had cut open the skies above Germany, and the bombers had flown through the breach again and again. Each raid was a hammer blow, each escort another nail in the coffin of Luftwaffe supremacy. The breaking point was not dramatic, it was relentless. And it had been reached. When the smoke finally cleared, the skies over Germany were no longer the same. The contrails that once tangled into knots of combat drifted apart, thinning into silence. Wreckage lay scattered across fields, forests, and city streets. Bomb craters pocked the heart of Berlin, while the countryside bore scars of metal and flame. To those who had lived through it, the day the Mustangs cut into the Luftwaffe was unforgettable. To history, it marked the irreversible turning of the tide. In the weeks that followed, Allied commanders studied the results with quiet satisfaction. The losses were still high, bombers and fighters had fallen, but the mission had proved that daylight raids into the deepest reaches of Germany were possible, even against concentrated resistance. The bomber offensive, once a gamble that bled the 8th Air Force nearly dry, had been reborn. Now it was not a question of survival but of pressure, constant, unyielding pressure that Germany could not resist indefinitely. For the Luftwaffe, the Berlin raid was more than a defeat. It was a shattering of illusion. Once their air force had symbolized invincibility. Now its weaknesses were laid bare before the world. Skilled pilots were gone. Fuel supplies dwindled. Replacement crews, rushed into combat with only a handful of hours in the cockpit, were fed into battles they could not win. The machine that had carried blitzkrieg across Europe was grinding itself into dust. And no amount of propaganda could conceal the truth forever. Yet even in defeat, the Luftwaffe's courage deserves recognition. Men still climbed into their cockpits knowing the odds. They still faced the Mustangs head-on, still defended their homeland with every ounce of skill and bravery they possessed. Their struggle, though doomed, was fierce. For the Americans, too, the victory was tempered with grief. Empty bunks, silent mess halls, folded flags. They bore the weight of comrades lost. The skies had been won at a price measured not only in wreckage but in lives. As 1944 rolled on, the effects rippled outward. Oil refineries burned. Rail lines lay twisted. Aircraft plants struggled to keep pace under the relentless bombardment. The Wehrmacht, already strained on the Eastern Front and in Italy, felt the air war tighten like a vice. Supplies faltered, reinforcements slowed, mobility vanished. The Luftwaffe could no longer shield the army below. Without control of the skies, the Reich was vulnerable everywhere. Its heartlands, its armies, its future. The Mustang was no longer just an airplane. It was a symbol of inevitability. Sleek and fast, it had carried the promise of survival to the bomber crews, and the threat of annihilation to their enemies. In the pubs of England and the newspapers of America, its name became legend. To the Germans, it was a shadow that stretched across the sun, a relentless guardian that denied them their skies. In every sense, the battle for Berlin had proven its worth. Looking back, the meaning is clear. Wars are not decided in a single day, nor by a single machine. But some days change the trajectory of history. March 1944 was one of them. That day showed that Germany could no longer command the air, that its shield was cracked beyond repair. From then on, the Allies pressed forward with gathering momentum, until the Reich itself collapsed under the weight of fire from above and steel from below. And so the story of the Mustangs and the Luftwaffe is not only about victory and defeat. It is about transformation. The transformation of a war that once seemed balanced into one that leaned inexorably toward Allied triumph. The transformation of young pilots into veterans hardened by fire. The transformation of hope into despair, courage into legend, power into ashes. These are the currents that shaped the outcome of World War II. For us today, these lessons endure. They remind us that innovation, determination, and the will to endure can shift even the most desperate struggles. They remind us that behind every machine are the men who flew them, who risked everything in battles that defined their generation. And they remind us too that every victory comes with a cost written in silence, in absence, in memories carried home but never forgotten. If you've stayed with this story until the end, I want to thank you. These tales of courage, sacrifice, and transformation are not just relics of the past. They are reminders of what people endured, and what it took to shape the world we know today. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that dive deep into the battles, the machines, and the people who defined the Second World War, then I invite you to join us here. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey into history. And if this story moved you, share it, because these voices, these moments deserve to be remembered. The day the Mustangs crushed Germany's fighter force was more than a clash in the sky. It was a turning point in the war, a chapter written in fire and steel, in courage and sacrifice. Its legacy endures, in the echoes of engines, in the memory of those who flew, and in the lesson that even the fiercest storm can be broken. So as we close the canopy on this story, let the engines fade, let the contrails dissolve into the evening sky. The war carried on, but from that day the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe had fallen from the heights it once ruled. The Mustangs had risen. And history itself had turned its face toward the final victory.